Good morning. Welcome to the 12th session in our Indiana Uplands housing series. This morning, we're really excited about this presentation. We're going to be talking about using residential tax increment financing districts to create housing in your communities. And we're very excited to have our guests with us today to talk to us all about how they created 2 residential TIF districts in Warsaw, Indiana. So this morning joining us, we're going to have Jeremy Skinner. He is the Community and Economic Development Director at the City of Warsaw. He will be joined by Randy Rompola. He is a partner at Barnes and Thornburg, and Todd Samuelson, who is a partner with Baker Tilly. And this is the team that worked with him to accomplish this goal. So we're very happy to have them this morning, and we're really excited that you were able to join us. We will be recording this and posting it on our website for future reference. If you've missed any of our previous sessions, please, you can find them on our website at regionalopportunityinc.org. So this morning, without further ado, let's get started because this is a big topic and we have lots to talk about. So I'd like to invite Jeremy, Todd, and Randy to join me. And I also would like to encourage you guys along the way, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and I will be monitoring the chat and we will make sure that they get answered. So first up this morning, we're going to have Randy. Or not Randy, Jeremy, I apologize for that. And let me share my screen. Jeremy, go ahead and take it away. Please let me know when you want the next slide. Jeremy, you're muted.
There we go.
Great, thank you.
Thanks for everyone joining us this morning. It's been a long road for us to get to this point. We've been dealing with housing issues probably since about 2015. Shortly after the housing bubble, we had a rebound in housing. Unfortunately, it didn't last long, and starting around 2015, we started to see our housing decrease, our housing new construction decrease quite a bit, and a lot of demand issues. So starting in 2015, we started looking at those numbers, trying to understand, and Lisa, can you advance to the next slide? Just trying to figure out why the stagnation, our new housing starts. We knew that our demand was pretty high. We were dealing with a lot of people saying there weren't a lot of housing options for them. So beginning in 2015, trying to figure out what those issues were, we started to reach out to different builders, different developers, to try to figure out what we could do as a city to help this issue. In late 2016, early 2017, we began those conversations with the County Builders Association and various local developers, trying to come up with potential solutions. From 15 to 2018, we had a pretty steady number of new homes constructed, but we were about 50% less than what we were pre-housing pandemic or pre-housing bust. So back in 2008, 2010, when the housing issues arose, we were seeing around 70 new homes built. Going forward in 2015 through 18, we were around 40 new homes built per year. Please, you can go to the next slide. So working with them, we identified a number of issues that we felt needed to be addressed. Some of them were within our control. Some of them probably were not within our control. Access to capital was one of the major issues that we found. And it wasn't necessarily coming out of the housing bust that the money wasn't there. It was the cost of the money that was the larger issue. There were people willing to make the investments, but they weren't willing to make the investments without a substantial return on their money. So pre-housing bust, the money was cheaper for residential development. Post-housing bust, the money was still there, but having a lot of investors that may have lost some money during that time period on housing developments, The access to that capital was at a higher cost, which then created a number of issues for developers and builders when trying to access that capital and their return on investment. Some of the other issues we noticed in our conversations was the upfront construction cost. The cost of construction, the upfront cost for those builders to start new construction and developers to start new developments was an issue. It was a drastic increase from the pre-housing bust period, which was causing them some issues in terms on their return on investment as well. Labor shortage was also an issue, continues to be an issue. That's something we can work with our local schools and local technical institutions to create some more available labor for those developers and contractors. Not as much direct response, or not as much that we can do in that regards, but certainly something we can help our local education institutions work on. Available land and buildable lots is another issue, a major issue for us. We have a lot of development on the peripheral of the city, but not some of it has occurred over the last 30, 40 years, which has kind of hamstrung the city in trying to expand and annex property outside of the city limits. And the last issue we noticed was the cost of land had increased quite a bit over the last 5 or 6 years, which was causing, once again, that return on investment to be hampered by developers as they look to make those investments. And even those that were giving them access to capital, those numbers were a struggle for both developers and builders. Early on, we attended an Northeast Indiana Regional Partnership housing seminar, and a lot of that was just talking about capital stacking for larger projects. The city began discussing with some local partners the potential for doing the housing study in early 2018 and late 2018. Once we identified how we were going to go about doing that, we entered into an agreement with the community foundation, our local county community foundation, the county itself and the city, and we engaged a local or a regional partner, HPG Networks, to perform a countywide housing study for us that they began in the spring of 2019. That study was on a piggyback of the regional partnership study. The regional partnerships did an 11 county study using HPG, but while it gave us decent information, it didn't get down to some of the more finer details that we were looking for. So we engaged HPG Networks to dig a little deeper, specifically in Kosciuszko County. They did every community in Kosciuszko County as well as the city of Warsaw. So there's a lot of information that we obtained from that housing study that was done in 2019. Can you go to the next slide? So once we signed that contract, they began work early 2019. We created a group that kind of walked them through the process and the information that we wanted to see, as well as we did a lot of planning on what would happen, what happens after we completed that study, so that we didn't just end up with a lot of information and nowhere to go. At the same time, around the same time, IHCDA had created a potential program, this workforce anchor employee workforce housing program in 2019. We had engaged with IHCDA and HPG Network and Zimmer Biomed to be an applicant in that program. And I think we were awarded that grant in late 2019. So at the same time we were doing the housing study, we created this community group, a community-wide housing focus group that was engaged in the housing study and in this workforce housing program put on by IHCDA. So there's a lot of things happening during 2019. Unfortunately, we completed the housing study in late 2019. We were set to kind of present that to the public, present those findings to the public around the same time the pandemic hit. So it kind of put a little bit of a a challenge in front of us, so we didn't get that information out as soon as we would have liked to have. And it ended up being late 2020 before we were really able to go to the public with that information. But it has really helped us create a program and create a path forward on how we're going to tackle some of our housing issues. So at the same time we were doing the housing study and we were doing the ICDA grant application, we were creating the 2 residential TIF districts in late 2019 as well. One of the reasons why we were probably one of the first communities to do it is some of that buildup that from 2016 to 2018, a lot of the research we had done, some of the things that we had instituted, and I'll talk about a little later, were creating a challenge for us because we were starting to see our housing tick up. And if we didn't get these residential TIF districts created by the end of 2019, we probably wouldn't have qualified for it moving forward. So in late 2019, we put together the 2 residential TIF districts. The northern TIF district was one of our heavily developed areas, but there was still a lot of demand and want to be in that district. The south residential TIF district was not. It's an area that we had been trying to incentivize housing for the last half decade and just haven't been successful in doing so. So those 2 TIF districts had completely different goals. Obviously, the north goal was to continue that momentum of housing building. The south goal is to create new housing opportunities, specifically focused around some of the schools in that area. We received, like I said, we received that housing demand study in 2020. We began working on various projects, and we are currently still trying to work with the ICDA on what that workforce anchor, or the anchor employee workforce housing program looks like. And hopefully later this year, we will be submitting a project that will tie in that program. Can we go to the next slide, Lisa? So as we worked through a lot of these different opportunities from 17 to 18, we tried to tackle some of the smaller low-hanging fruit that we thought might create new housing opportunities. So we gave them some flexibility on the sewer tap fees. So instead of paying that upfront cost, they got to pass that through on the development cost, and it gets amortized over a 10-year period. There were some city construction standards that a lot of builders were having issues with that were costing them not a significant amount of money, but enough money that it was an issue to them. So we adjusted some of those standards to reduce that cost, that upfront cost on those new home builds. In 2018, the biggest thing we did to try to reduce some of those upfront acquisition and land costs was we annexed around 300 acres of developable land, and we discussed and worked with developers on a number of infill development options, some older subdivisions that had some available lots, and some newer subdivisions that didn't have the allure that some of the other developments did on the north side. Specifically on the south side, there were a number of subdivisions that had 30-40 lots that were available. So we worked on incentivizing those for development in 2018 and 19. Can you go to the next slide? So we continue to work with the Community Foundation and Zimmer Environment on the ICDA Anchor Employee Grant. That program, if you're not familiar with it, established $2 million in available development capital, $1 million from the Anchor Employees Zimmer Biomet, and then $1 million from ICDA. We're still trying to figure out what that looks like. The $1 million from ICDA has not been committed. They're wanting to see an actual project submitted. So we're working through a potential project and what their money looks like and how that capital gets infused into that development. We created the 2 residential TIF districts, which allow us to incentivize future infrastructure, which will help reduce that upfront land cost and potentially increase access to capital. Can you go to the next slide? So where are we at this point? We've seen some decent increase in single family homes in 19 and 20. Primarily, I think the large increase in 19 was some of the things that we were doing behind the scenes, including reducing that upfront cost, helping builders with construction standards. The dip that we saw in 2020, I think, is more after incentivizing some of these developments. The reality was we still did not have enough available lots for construction. So while we saw a pretty good increase in 2019, it dropped back down in 2020 because where we stand today is just a lack of land or lack of buildable lots. So we still saw an increase in 2020, but a lot of those lots that were available, those infill development options, some of the older subdivisions that had lots that were available that we worked with developers and builders on, those are no longer available at this point. Most of them have been built out. Two of the older subdivisions lots have all been filled in the last 2 years. So we have a lot of land that we annexed in that we now have to create new buildable lots on, which was where the north and the south residential Tif districts are going to focus on in the next 2 to 3 years. That'll be our big program, our big projects over as we move forward, is to create those new developments that don't exist today. Can you go to the next slide? So 2020 will be the first year we have collected any revenue for to incentivize new developments. We are looking, got fairly decent projects in the works right now. We've got about 6 different projects that we're working on, and those are just single family home mixed use developments. We have a number of other residential developments that we're working on that are more apartment based. We've got one affordable housing unit project that's under construction now. We have another one that will be submitting to the ICDA in July. So we're creating those new lots, or trying to create those new lots. A lot of them have gone through pre-development. Some of them are waiting on their preliminary and final plat approvals. The 62 lot development downtown took an old school that was moved out of town. There was about 25 acres there of that school. That school's been purchased, demoed, and is going to be replaced with a 62 lot single family townhome mixed use development downtown, or right on the fringe of downtown. So we're pretty excited about that project. We've looked at a number of other townhome projects, and we have 3 or 4 pretty decent size acreage developments that will add 300 or 400 new buildable lots in the next 2 to 3 years. All of these are kind of contingent on us participating in some of that new infrastructure cost to reduce that land cost and the upfront development cost. Most of them will involve some type of sewer infrastructure improvements as part of this development. Some of them will involve abatements, tax abatements. Because the TIF district's relatively new and it's not generating a lot of cash, it doesn't give us a lot of upfront money to use for infrastructure construction. And with residential, you're not going to have a huge amount of money to do a bond issue. So a lot of the projects that we're looking at are going to be pay as we go type projects. We'll look at what incentives we can give each development, whether it's specific to infrastructure or even a payback on new home construction. But we're pretty excited about where we're at in terms of the progress we've made. Like I said, we've got roughly 6 projects that are in the works now, and we have a number of apartment projects that we're working on as well. Go to the next slide, Lisa. These next few slides are really not, these I think there's like 5 or 6 of these slides. These are the slides that I actually used with the public hearing portion of the TIF requirement. So I just wanted to give you an idea of what I did with those public hearing presentations. I just mostly described the process to the community, and we had 4 public hearings because we had two TIF districts, and each TIF district required more than one public hearing, but it didn't specifically say the number. And I'm sure Randy and Todd can discuss that in more in depth. But we did 4 public hearings, and we focused those public hearings at the schools within the districts that we were targeting for 2 reasons. One, to involve the school district, and 2, because they were kind of central to those districts. So it provided a great opportunity to bring the community together. I went through the application process and the time frame with the community on what this TIF district process looks like and what the advantages are and how long it takes to get there. At the same time, you can go to the next slide. I provided them a map of the 2 districts and then talked about potential development options within those districts and what those developments looked like. Our focus on our 2 TIF districts were primarily single family residential. We were not looking at apartments or high density residential in these districts. They were set up to focus on single family. You can go to the next slide. So both in the south and the north districts, we're focused heavily on single family. We do have multifamily targeted, but those are in some of our other districts, other TIF districts. And so we're kind of combining the residential and some of our commercial, our downtown district, to create those different housing opportunities. So for the public presentation portion to the community, most of our developments are focused on single family housing, which directly benefits those school districts and creating potential new children for each of those districts, for each of those schools within those districts. We had 2 elementary schools, and each district had one of them. The North District has its challenges because of the construction demand in that area. The South District had less children, so we're trying to create more opportunities to put children in that South school district. Go to the next slide. I explained to them kind of the process, the lifespan, which has changed. It's not 20 years, but when we applied or when we created these TIF districts in 2019, it was 20 years. I know it's 25 now, which is a little irritating to me, but nonetheless, we're on a 20-year time frame as it stands now. Explain kind of the process, the collection of the taxes, and what we would do with those new taxes generated. Can you go to the next slide? And then we talked a lot about the opportunities, what we were trying to accomplish with these TIF districts with the community. I think that was probably the most important thing for me, is making sure that they understood what our goals were. And I created a couple of goals that you'll see on the next slide, but it's really explaining the process, explaining how we were going to use the funds, what was available through the statute for those TIF districts, and then the type of partnerships that we would be developing with people within our community, developers, builders within our community, so that it wasn't just us collecting tax dollars. Can you go to the next slide? So we talked a lot about the goals that we wanted to create within our community, within these 2 TIF districts. We wanted a variety of housing options. We talked about creating a mixture of affordability levels. And then we were really focused on targeting those school districts that were going to benefit from these developments. Eisenhower and Washington are the 2 schools in that district that are most important to us, because they probably lack the number of students that they could have. They had some space, they had some availability for growth in those districts. So that's that South District that we targeted pretty heavily. And then we had Harrison, Lincoln, and Jefferson were also some areas that we wanted to target. The school district wanted to target for new growth. A lot of the programs that we're looking at, the projects we're looking at trying to incentivize now, really hit pretty heavily on those 2 first points: a variety of housing options and a mixture of affordability. The one housing project that we have downtown is 62 units. It has a mixture of duplexes, townhomes, and single family homes all in one development. So it's really ticking those two goals and creating a variety of housing options and a variety of affordability levels. We realized early on through our conversations with builders and developers that it was going to be really challenging to hit anything less than 220 to 250 for new construction. But by targeting that kind of that construction range, we felt like we would be freeing up people transitioning from those 150 to 180,000 homes into the 220 to 250 homes, which would then open up that kind of real basic beginner workforce housing. And as we've watched our housing market over the last few years, I think we're starting to see some of that happen. So by creating these variety of housing options, creating the mixture of affordability, we're also opening up some of the lower end affordability on housing that's really targeting that workforce that workforce development, that workforce housing that we're trying to create. Can we go to the next slide? So we've certainly had some hurdles along the way. I think the challenge for us has always been, and we have a number of TIF districts, not just residential. We have 3 other TIF districts in the city of Warsaw that I manage and that we've seen a lot of growth in. So from the public standpoint, it's really important for us to educate them early on how the TIF works, what our goals are. We are heavily focused on each district as its own engine. So we don't have any spider TIFs. We don't connect our TIF districts. Each TIF district has its own set of goals, objectives that it's trying to meet, and we go out and create new projects, create infrastructure improvements within those districts to create or accomplish those goals, create new development opportunities. We brought the school corporation in. What I thought was, we held the meetings in the school and we invited the school. They did not participate in those meetings. And then later on, it was an issue in that maybe we didn't educate them enough along the way. So Todd will talk about some of the things that he did to bring the school corporation and us together so that we were all both on the same page, but it was a struggle early on with them trying to get them into the project. So anybody going through this process, you bring the school corporations on as early as possible, get them involved in the program so you don't face that as a hurdle later on. One of the things you'll want to be conscious of is the timing. For you may be as critical as it was for us. There are requirements on housing and number of housing, percentages of housing. So pay attention to those numbers as you see your community, where you're at now and where you might be a year from now, so you don't get impacted by those potential hurdles. We had, like I said, 4 public meetings. We advertised them. We put them on our schedule. I wish we would have had more participation. In reality, I think we had a total of 18 people show up for those 4 meetings. And a lot of them were elected officials, which was good for me because it allowed me to have some pretty good conversations with them about where our goals were. But from the public standpoint, the people that showed up were really just people looking for housing. So it didn't do them a lot of good, other than it was good to see that the people were interested in wanting a variety of housing opportunities in the future. You can go to the next slide. So some of the other things you might want to consider is what are you trying to create in each district? Specifically, what type of housing do you want to see, and what that impact will be on those areas. We were very specific, like I said, and our focus was single family. And we were really looking at helping the school districts in each of those regions continue to grow. Some of the other things you might look is scale development and what that impact might be on that area. Type of housing, affordability, mixed use, single family. What kind of housing are you looking for within each district? Each district can kind of be its own entity. We have some other areas that are TIF'd that we are more heavily focused on multifamily and mixed use. So our 2 residential TIF districts did not focus on that. But you certainly could, any community could be looking at a residential TIF district that might be focused on more multifamily and mixed use type developments, higher density developments, depending on the community and where you're looking to see that growth occur. So those were some of the hurdles we face, and those are some of the things I think you can look at as a community moving forward, where you're targeting these residential TIF districts. And certainly I would be available for anybody that might have questions.
Actually, Jeremy, thank you very much. This is really interesting, and we do have a couple questions. And I'm going to start with what I consider to be the easier of the two. So what are the incentives used to secure or entice developments?
So initially, what we're seeing is just upfront infrastructure cost is a challenge for developers because the land cost has increased. The land availability is somewhat tight. And then you have that infrastructure cost on top of it. So right now we'll be focusing on sanitary sewer improvements. We have 2 projects that require a significant investment in a lift station, both on the north and the south. So we're looking at infrastructure improvements in those two areas, centered around us putting in lift stations to help reduce that upfront cost.
Great. And the next one is, could you address how you handled political pushback against development? Were there any activists or elected officials who didn't want to build more housing?
That was a great question. Each community is going to be its own animal, so to speak. We are very aggressive and have been since I've been here. I took over in Warsaw in 2004. Their TIF districts in general were there, but they were not aggressive in terms of creating new development opportunities. So from 2004 to now, we really changed the face of those districts and became more specific in goals and objectives and projects and what we are trying to accomplish. So I don't think if I were in your shoes and you had a lot of pushback, I'd be specific in what goals you're trying to accomplish, what projects you're trying to target, so that they don't feel like it's just an overall picture that maybe they don't understand. The more specific you get, the more specific type of project you target, I think you can start to make them understand, why are we doing X, Y, and Z? We're doing X, Y, and Z because we have a housing shortage. And this specific housing shortage is in single family homes, or in this price range, on apartments and in this price range. We've always been very specific in the targets and the projects that we do and the improvements that we make, no matter what TIF district is, whether it's an economic development area or whether it's a residential TIF. We are very specific in what we're trying to accomplish, and explaining that to the elected officials so that they understand why you're going from point A to point B and what the goal and the objectives are for each of those districts, I think is important, not only to the community, but to that elected official. So he has to go out and face the public and explain to them, why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? So being able to provide that roadmap for them, I think, is a huge responsibility of people that sit in our seats.
Okay, thank you so much. That was really great. We are going to welcome Randy to talk to us about the legalities of creating a residential TIF.
Good morning. Appreciate the opportunity to be here and speak with you. And just to follow up on what Jeremy was talking about, I think the residential TIF provisions that have been put into the statute. Oops, let me start my video. Hopefully that's working. Sorry about that. Yeah, so residential TIF is just another tool in the arsenal for local governments. And just by way of background, I have here at Barnes and Thornburg, I work in the municipal finance department. I've been practicing in the area for 30 years now, and work on a variety of municipal law, municipal finance issues, Primary emphasis has always been economic development, and I've worked in and around the TIF statute, working with local communities as they try to craft incentives to entice developers to bring economic development to their communities. And to me, the residential TIF provisions are just a logical extension of what many communities have been doing, including Warsaw over the years, to bring new economic development to the community. And now that some of that is happening in some of our communities, as Jeremy had indicated in Warsaw, the businesses are recognizing, and I think other communities around the state, the business community is recognizing, great, we've got the incentives, we've got the available, the municipality providing available incentives for locating factories, businesses, office buildings, et cetera. As we occupy those factories and those businesses, where are people going to live? And so the residential TIF provides just another opportunity for local governments to incentivize future development and continue development. So next slide. I thought it would be helpful just maybe to step back. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with TIF itself and how you get to the point of being able to use the residential TIF provisions. So to use tax increment finance in Indiana, you have to have a redevelopment commission in place. And so the law allows cities, towns, and counties to create redevelopment commissions. The legislative body of the unit adopts an ordinance to establish the commission, and the redevelopment commission, once it's established, has jurisdiction over what is known as the redevelopment district. And frequently you hear people talk about TIF districts, and I really try to not use, and I sometimes do that, but I try not to use the term TIF district, because the redevelopment district is the entirety of the city or the town or the county. Just by virtue of creating the redevelopment commission, the redevelopment district is established. That is not the TIF area, if you will. That redevelopment district is a special taxing district, and the redevelopment commission has financing powers to be able to issue tax-backed bonds or bonds payable from tax revenues that would be levied on that redevelopment district. So I just like to keep the terminology separate. Next slide. Within the redevelopment district, the redevelopment commission can establish redevelopment areas or economic development areas as areas that are targeted for redevelopment or economic development activities. The older areas that you may have in your communities may be redevelopment areas, because that originally was the only term that could be used, or the only area that could be created. Economic development areas, it's not so new now, but they've been around since the early 90s. And it's more of a recognition that economic development is about creating jobs. Redevelopment earlier, back in the 70s and 80s, was about so-called slum and blight. And people don't like to acknowledge slum and blight in their communities. So economic development really achieves the same purpose, and that is revitalizing communities to create more jobs and better investment and assess value in your communities. But to use residential TIF, you've got to designate either a redevelopment area or an economic development area in your community. And we'll just talk a little bit about the process to do that. Another term, and this is where the rubber meets the road in terms of TIF, is the designation of that area or a portion of that area as a tax increment finance allocation area. And that is where the TIF that is being used or being generated within that area. So it's possible to have multiple allocation areas in a economic development area. It's not common, but it is possible. And certainly in the case today, as we're talking about residential TIF, the residential TIF area, and I'll reference this later, but the TIF that's being generated from that residential TIF area has to be used for that residential housing project. So to the extent that you have an existing economic development area and an allocation area, you could be creating a separate allocation area for purposes of residential TIF that you will be able to track the TIF that's being generated from that area and being applied then to the residential housing program. Next slide. So, and Todd probably will get into this in greater detail, but as you create the area in a particular year, if we were to create an area today, an economic development area, and designate it as an allocation area for purposes of tax increment, the base date for that allocation area will be the prior January 1st. So all of the assessed value that is in place as of January 1st, 2021 would be referred to as the base assessed value. Any then incremental increase in assessed value, that would be the tax increment assessed value. And that is what would be captured, the tax revenues being generated from that incremental assessed value is what would be captured within the allocation fund and be set aside for the redevelopment commission to use. So as we talk about TIF and we talk about the tools that TIF can provide, recognize that if you designate an area, any taxes being paid prior to January 1, or I'm sorry, any assessed value in place prior to January 1, the taxes being paid on that assessed value will continue to flow to all of the overlapping taxing units. But any increases in that area as a result of incremental increases in assessed value, that will be captured and, as the slide indicates, under the control of the redevelopment commission to be used for accomplishing the criteria set out in the redevelopment or economic development plan. And with respect to residential, the residential housing program. Next slide. So just to step back a bit, the theory of TIF, going way back as it was created and it was upheld by the Indiana Supreme Court, is that there exists an obstacle to redevelopment or economic development in the community, and it's not possible for a particular area in your community to develop, I'll say, naturally. And as the statute says, the ordinary operations of private enterprise. So you have kind of what is routinely referred to as the classic but-for test. If you are not able to create the TIF area, the development wouldn't have happened. And that's the simplest test for using tax increment, and particularly here residential tax increment. And the solution that was identified was to use the new property tax revenue that's being generated from any development that might occur to pay for removing those identified obstacles. So any increment that would be generated, all of the overlapping tax units would be supporting that development by allowing the redevelopment commission to capture the increment or the taxes from that incremental assessed value to help pay for the development. Next slide. So this is a busy slide. I actually, Todd and I in our materials actually had the same slide, and I suppose we can debate later who created it. I was using it here within the firm, and I saw Todd had the same slide as it relates to tax increment. I thought I would try to do something a little bit different, so we're not talking from the same slide. But so this basically shows it looks like a couple of words got lopped off here. This should be the incremental value. For some reason, I'm not seeing that on my screen, but there should be some words there. But so basically, what is in black, that is, as I said, the base assessed value. So you have the tax rate that's in place. The tax rate would be applied to the base assessed value, that value that was there before January 1, and that would be paid out to all of the overlapping tax units. So the only thing that the redevelopment commission would capture would be the incremental increase, the incremental assessed value. The tax rate would be applied to that, and that assessed value would be captured and paid over to the redevelopment commission. And I'll note here, and I'm sure Todd will touch on it as well, one of the key people in a TIF area is the county auditor. And I know Todd's firm works closely with county auditors around the state to make sure that as TIF areas are created and they continue to be operated by the redevelopment commission, that the proper allocation of base to incremental assessed value is allocated so that the commission is collecting what it should be collecting and the overlapping tax units should be collecting what they're collecting. So as we're talking about residential TIF, to the extent the property is generating any tax revenue as of a particular January 1st, that would be paid to the taxing units. As new houses are built, and we'll talk about the ability to do condominiums and townhomes now as well, but as those properties are being built, generating assessed value, new assessed value, the increment, that would be paid over to the Redevelopment Commission to help fund costs of supporting the efforts. So that's just kind of a brief overview of how TIF works, and Todd can correct anything I've said as he speaks. But so let's go to the next slide and kind of dive into a little bit about residential housing TIF. So it was enacted in 2019, and as Jeremy said, Warsaw was, I think, probably one of the first around the state to jump into it. And as it came into the statute, residential housing was identified as single family dwelling units, just kind of the prototypical housing, right, that communities build. There was a 2020 amendment to the statute, so now residential housing will include condominiums and townhouses, but only within an identified economic development target area. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But so it is possible in economic development target area, that designation can only be used by cities and towns. So if you're in a city or a town, you can look at projects that now include condominiums and townhomes as well as single family dwelling units. So certainly the city of Warsaw, as it's looking at its projects, could also look at condominiums and townhouses. But as I said, you know, the original statute only included single family dwelling units, which is interesting. I heard something on the news the other day about how Canada is running out of land, and the tradition in Canada is single family housing. And I think we here in the United States, because I've worked on here in Indiana with all of the growth we've had and the communities growing outward, you're starting to see communities now grow upward. And it is still the case that traditional TIF can be used for a condominium project, but there are some very not complicated but odd rules that the condominium project has to be greater than 4 stories. So if you have a project where the condominium project is greater than 4 stories, you don't necessarily need to use residential housing TIF. You could use the traditional TIF statute that's in existence. But I think this is a recognition that condominium projects that are 4 stories or greater are not common in a lot of smaller communities in Indiana, where land is more plentiful, maybe expensive, but more plentiful. And so you see sort of the growing outward rather than upward. But I know in some of the cities, the larger cities in Indiana, we have worked on condominium TIF projects that are, you know, multiple stories, well above 4 stories. Residential housing development program, it's just a term in the statute that again contemplates the construction of new or renovation of existing single family housing, which again with economic development target area designation would include condominiums and townhomes. So next slide. Jeremy touched on the 1% rule, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on it, but again, the general test is that to establish the housing program, you need to show that in the construction of new single family houses in the prior 3 years is less than 1% of the total of single family homes within the city or town. If you're in the county, if it's a county redevelopment commission, that unincorporated portion of the county actually relates to the township. So if you have a residential TIF program that you're looking to establish in an unincorporated portion of the county, you would look then to measure the single family housing growth within the township that the residential TIF area would be identified in. But again, there is an exception to the 1% rule. There was a 2020 amendment in the General Assembly that now allows for cities and towns not to have to meet that 1% test for housing programs that are established within an economic development target area. That designation is, and some of you may be familiar with it, it's a creature of the tax abatement statute. Tax abatement, as you know, is generally for manufacturing facilities, warehouses, that sort of economic development. But there is a provision in the tax abatement statute that does allow for residential tax abatement where a city or town designates the target area. So it is for low income housing, there's a target area requirement designation frequently as folks work with the state to get tax credits. And so I know some of you probably in your city and town councils probably have had to identify a particular area as an economic development target area. Next slide. So just to touch on the exception, because Jeremy spoke to the rule, and I actually saw a question pop up here, who verifies the 1% qualification? Typically, the municipal advisor will work with the city, and Todd may touch on that as well. The DLGF has you reporting that to the DLGF, so ultimately they're reviewing that as well, the 1% designation. Just to speak to the exception to the rule, because it's new, and for those of you in cities and towns, it's a way to avoid. So you may have had growth that maybe puts you outside of the 1%. So you think, well, maybe this isn't, I'm not eligible, but you still could be eligible in a city or town. This is not available to a county, and primarily because the economic development target area designation in the tax abatement statute speaks to the designation by a city common council or a town council. It is not, as currently written, available to counties. And as I mentioned, it's typically the designation is typically made in conjunction with tax abatement for residential development. Oddly enough, it involves the approving action of the Economic Development Commission, which is not a normal course of action for redevelopment or for tax abatement. But the way the statute's written, you have to have an Economic Development Commission in place, which again, some of you may be familiar with. The Economic Development Commission is typically used for conduit bond financings, where the city or town is issuing the bond and loaning the proceeds to a developer, in part to get some tax advantages, to be able to issue tax exempt bonds. There are certain manufacturing projects that you can do that. Not-for-profit hospitals or educational institutions, charter schools that are not-for-profits will typically finance through an Economic Development Commission of a city or town. But here, we just need the Economic Development Commission to approve the designation, and then it would go to the Common Council or Town Council, which would adopt an ordinance to approve of the designation of the target area. And again, the target area for this purpose, for residential TIF, will allow you to avoid the application of the 1% rule. The one caveat is that you cannot designate more than 15% of the city or town as an economic development target area. That sounds like a lot, but again, in the context of tax abatement, it's not unusual for communities to designate larger portions of their community as an economic revitalization area or a target area for purposes of telling developers we're open for business, we'll consider tax abatement in these areas. On the redevelopment side, I think it would be very unusual to have 15% of your city or town as a residential TIF area. The TIF allocation area is supposed to be fairly discrete. As Jeremy mentioned, the city of Warsaw has 3 other areas, and they're all fairly discrete areas. And so I don't think the 15% issue would be an issue at all, or the requirement would be an issue at all for residential TIF, but that is something that lurks in the tax abatement statute that you would just want to be aware of if you're going down this path. So next slide. Jeremy touched on the process. I think I'll say this, Jeremy has said it, and I'm sure Todd will hit it as well. I mean, the key thing for residential TIF is getting out in front of the approval process, getting to the school corporation, and it's possible, depending upon your area, there may be multiple schools, right? Your area may touch one school corporation, but you may have 2 school corporations depending upon your territory, right? You have overlapping tax units where you may have your proposed area where you want to have houses built. There may be 2 school corporations operating in that entire territory. So you would need to involve the superintendent and the school board from both schools. But the key thing is getting out in front and getting there early. The big difference between several differences, but in my view, the big difference between designating, and some of you may have already done this, where you designate a traditional economic development area and tax increment finance area and allocation area, and a residential TIF allocation area, is the approval process. the school board does have to approve the designation of a residential TIF area, unlike the traditional TIF designation, where although you send notice and you send a tax impact statement that the municipal advisor prepares that shows what impact there may be in creating the allocation area, there is not that formal approval process. And so typically we would encourage there to be communications between the city or town, the redevelopment commission, and some of the overlapping taxing units, even in the general TIF designation. Here, where the school board has to take affirmative action, you clearly want to make sure they are getting all of the information they need to make the right decision. And so you want to start that process very early. The statute, anticipates that, because it actually requires that you, as stated there, that you consult with persons interested in or affected by the proposed program, and specifically points out superintendents and the school board president. And so it's best to bring them in under the tent early and make them see the need, and involve the legal staff, the municipal advisors, to help them understand how this may affect them. There's a lot of misconceptions about TIF in the state, and certainly having the opportunity to get them in the tent early and show them what you're trying to accomplish and how you're trying to benefit the community, that would be a good thing. I saw a question pop up about, is the school board the only approving authority? Outside the normal, and we'll talk about that in a minute on the next slide or two, but outside the normal approval process to create a redevelopment area with respect to residential TIF, yes, the school board is the additional approval authority. Statute does require that you provide opportunities for affected neighborhood associations, residents, and township assessors to be involved in the planning. Not sure what all that means, but again, typically you're going to reach out to the assessor, you're going to reach out to the school, you may reach out to the other overlapping taxing units and show them the benefits as well. But the key would be the school, given the approval process. Jeremy mentioned that when Warsaw created under the original statute their residential TIF areas, the statute referenced multiple hearings, and it referenced at least one of those hearings occurring in the territory sought to be designated as a residential TIF area. Another positive amendment last year was to reduce the multiple hearings to one public hearing, and they removed completely the requirement that the hearing be in the territory. That can be awkward because there may not be a public meeting space in that territory. It may be bare ground, but they did remove that requirement. So now it is just one public hearing. You do have to provide notice 30 days in advance, as the slide indicates, and you do have to provide that notice to all of the overlapping tax units, and including the school corporation, the superintendent, and the school board president. But again, that shouldn't be the first time you're talking to the school. That should be a process that starts pretty early as you're thinking about residential TIF, so that you can view them and they can view you as a partner in the process. I think we can go to the next slide. So again, a little bit of spade work to do up front. So the process does start with the Redevelopment Commission adopting a declaratory resolution, but the work up front would be to identify the area, come up with a plan, discuss with school officials, confirm the 1% test, or as noted, complete the economic development target area designation. If you are in a city or town and recognize you can't meet the 1% test, then you would look to go through the economic target area designation, which again requires your economic development commission. So if you don't presently have a commission, you would need the city or town council to establish one and populate it with good volunteers, and get that body in place, and then have the city or town council then take the action to make the target area designation. And it's not a difficult, it's basically an ordinance where they are, and I don't think I mentioned this earlier, it's an ordinance where they are basically identifying that territory as, it overlaps the redevelopment designation, frankly. It's them basically saying within this target area, we need to use special powers. And again, from the tax abatement statute, that would be primarily tax abatement, but here obviously we're talking about redevelopment and using tax increment as a tool. There does need to be a development plan, and I think Jeremy may have touched upon that, but you think about what do you need to make the housing be constructed from a public standpoint, infrastructure, land aggregation. There may be multiple parcels owned by multiple people, and the redevelopment commission can help bring all of that together. So you would need to prepare that development plan. So once you've done all of the upfront work, you've brought in the school superintendent, the school board, and you've had those discussions, then the redevelopment commission does declare the residential TIF area. And it is, you're still using the existing redevelopment statute. So you're declaring an economic development area or a redevelopment area, but you're layering into that declaratory resolution the additional language that would be required for the residential TIF designation. And typically, again, you would work with somebody like me and somebody like Todd to get to the point of having that declaratory resolution be adopted by the redevelopment commission. And as I mentioned, the process at that point is very similar to the normal designation of an economic development area or an economic redevelopment area. You would go to the plan commission. The plan commission is to look at your development plan. And frankly, it's a narrow approval. They're supposed to look at your plan and make sure that it conforms to the overall development plan for the city or town or the county. But typically all of these approvals relate to the tax increment, and it becomes a more holistic approval. But if you look at the statute, it's a very narrow role for the plan commission. Likewise, the next step is the town council, the common council, county commissioners approval. Their approval is, again, in the statute, fairly narrow. They're looking at the plan commission's order, their order of approval, and they are supposed to be confirming that or approving that. But again, typically it becomes more about an overall approval of the redevelopment effort, the economic development effort, how the residential TIF will be used, what the development plan looks like. So you really want to be prepared, as Jeremy indicated, with that public story, and you would begin to form that at that first public hearing where you're inviting folks to talk about residential TIF, and those initial upfront meetings with the school board and the school board president and the superintendent. Finally, after the legislative approval, the next step then would be for a public hearing by the redevelopment commission. And this is again where you would have a notice sent to all of the overlapping tax units. And part of that notice would be included with that notice would be the tax impact statement. And that's something typically that the municipal advisor like Todd would prepare, that would sort of lay out what information would be helpful to the overlapping tax units to show what the impact may be, positive or negative. Frequently it's a positive impact. And particularly if you're satisfying the but-for test, you'll see assessments grow, and you'll see the generation of new revenue that wouldn't necessarily have been there before if this process weren't undertaken. And I think I saw a question about the approval process. So the residential, the town council, common council, county commissioners, that approval is the same for both, whether it's a traditional TIF or a residential TIF, that approval is the same. The plan commission approval is the same. And this redevelopment commission, this final step is the same as well. Again, you notice the public hearing 10 days in advance, you send the tax impact statement to the overlapping tax units, and then the commission meeting will then they'll hold the public hearing and adopt the confirming resolution. I saw a question about future budgeting increases or impacts. I might defer that to Todd because he can talk a little bit more about that tax impact statement. But so I think the one thing I would note again, in terms of the overlapping tax units, the school corporations, in a residential TIF area, there is the upfront notice for that one public hearing that you're sending out 30 days in advance. So you really need to be prepared in a sense to address all of those issues upfront, and certainly again with the school far in advance even of that public hearing. But even again on the back end, you're doing that again. You're sending, which is traditional for a traditional TIF area, you're sending out that tax impact statement, etc. Really only at the back end. You may have less communication up front, but because of the approval process now for residential TIF, at least you want to be a little bit far more proactive than perhaps you might think you would need to be for traditional TIF. I think we can jump to the next slide. Jeremy mentioned that this change that, when Warsaw created their residential TIF areas, the statute provided that it was a 20-year life on the TIF. And it basically started from the time of the adoption of the confirming resolution, which, if you think about that, as Jeremy indicated, they're ripe for development now, but they don't, they're moving forward. Here it is 2021, a couple of years later, the pandemic happened, a lot of things can happen. But even if we didn't have these extraordinary circumstances over the last year or so, and some of you may know this from your traditional TIF area, when you create a TIF area and you're trying to entice developers and you're trying to provide the incentives, none of that happens overnight. And so you may have an area where you would like to provide for single family homes to be built, or perhaps condominiums or townhomes. It's rare that you've got a developer on the hook and you're almost to a point where you're shovel ready, right? And so it may take the designation and selling them that designation and the powers that TIF can bring to a project to bring developers in, and that can take a period of years. And so the good news is the legislature last year made the residential TIF provision mirror the traditional TIF provision. And so now it is in the residential TIF provision like the traditional TIF. The life of that TIF is 25 years after the date on which the first obligation is incurred to pay P&I on bonds or lease rentals. So you could go a period of years where you're accruing TIF on a pay-as-you-go basis, but you're not incurring a financing, so that your life of that TIF will be over that period. It won't count, right? That initial pay-as-you-go time will not count against the 25 years. The 25 years will kick in from the time you do a bond financing. Most TIF bonds, and Todd can speak to this, are not 25 years. They're anywhere from 15 or so to 22 or so. But so there is that, you have some flexibility there now that wasn't there before. And as Todd and I have talked, if any of you have created or were like Warsaw and kind of jumped in to the deep end of the pool quickly, that you can bring yourself within the 25 years, but it would require you to go amend and basically go through the entire process again, including getting the school board approval again. So that's something, if you have already created one, that you may think about whether or not it's beneficial for you to do that. Another provision that is put into the statute, you can only have one bond issue that's payable from the housing tax increment. I think the intent was to not create sort of an, residential TIF is you build the houses, people move into them, and you're good. That area is done. And so you don't kind of have, when you think about an industrial park or a retail area where you may have TIF that in kind of a traditional TIF mode, there's always new businesses coming into the area where you need to provide incentives. But I think the view is that for housing tax increment, you've identified the area and you are going to provide that incentive, houses will be built, and you're done. So there's only one bond that can be issued. I've not had this come up, and I frankly meant to chat with Todd. He may have a view as well, so I'll raise the question for Todd. He can answer it if he likes, if he's had the experience. But it seems to me when you say you can have one bond, bond counsel try to be creative. We may authorize one bond, but maybe we issue it in series. And so I think it may be possible to do that. There would be benefit to do that, particularly when development may occur in series, if you will. It won't all come on in 1 year, and so there may be the ability to issue those bonds in series to provide for that as the increment comes in. So that may be a possibility. Another limitation with respect to residential TIF is that the increment can be used only with respect to that residential TIF. So if you have an existing economic development area and you have within it or maybe adjacent to it an area that you think would be right for new housing starts, you can designate that as a new allocation area within the greater economic development area. This provision would say that you have to use the TIF to support that housing program. Now, I think that doesn't mean that the TIF has to be spent within the area. I think you still have the inner serving language that some of you may be familiar with, so that to the extent you have to run water lines to that area, but they're outside of the residential TIF allocation area, certainly I think you can use the money for that type of work. But you couldn't use the residential TIF increment for an economic development project somewhere else in the area that wouldn't necessarily be supporting that residential housing. I saw the question pop up about how many residential TIF areas can you have? You're not limited in that sense. Warsaw has 2. You would just go through the approval process for each of them, and in Warsaw's case, they did them essentially at the same time. So we'll jump on to the next slide. I'm just going to end quickly with a couple of slides about developer incentives. The first, so, you know, the question always is, how do we use this tool? How do we use TIF? And some of these are basically just stealing from kind of what has been the traditional incentives provided in economic development areas and economic development TIF areas. So to the extent the commission has access to funds, if you've got other TIF or if the city or town has funds, you can use some of that money up front and then reimburse yourself from the residential TIF as it's being generated from the projects or from the houses that are built. You can use it for property acquisition, and you could acquire it at fair market value, and then the incentive might be, as Jeremy indicated, the cost of property in Warsaw may be an issue for developers, and so you can have the redevelopment commission use funds to acquire the property and then dispose of that property. And there is a process that would allow the redevelopment commission to dispose of that property at virtually no cost to the developer if the commission were to make certain findings. The other case may be, we see this sometimes where the developer does have access to the property, they do have the ability to buy it, or maybe they have an option on it, and so you can have it so where the developer buys it and immediately sells it for that purchase price to the redevelopment commission, and then the commission can go through a process to dispose of that property back to the developer again at that below market price, so that the developer is basically having the cost of the property paid for by the redevelopment commission. There's another technique that's used from time to time. I've not used it here on the residential side, but certainly on the economic development side as an incentive, where the commission is leasing land from the developer during construction and paying rentals that will essentially address the developer's carrying costs. That might be another way, but these all presume, and I think we can go to the next slide, these all presume that, as does the next one, that presumes that the city or town, county has some funds that it can use to invest in the project up front, to help the developer with some of those upfront expenses. To the extent there are public infrastructure needs, roads, sidewalks, utility needs, the city, county, town can help pay for those as well, to help with the development that's needed. I referenced the public bidding rules would apply. Certainly any public money that is spent on the governmental side, public bidding will apply, but there is a way by using the economic development tax increment revenue bond model that basically provides for the unit to issue a bond, and the bond would be payable from the TIF that's generated from the project, and that bond then, those proceeds are then loaned to the developer. And there really is, it can be structured in different ways, and I won't get into the details, but there is a way to structure it so the developer doesn't have to have cash up front. And as the developer builds the project, as they build houses, they are deemed to have purchased the bond. So that allows the developer to basically monetize the commercial or the residential tax increment that will be generated from the houses that are being built up front. And so that he can have his bank buy that bond, or he can assign that interest to the bank, and the bank then can use those residential tax increment payments that will be made on the bond as additional collateral for the developer. In that model, the commission bears no risk. Certainly the redevelopment commission itself can issue bonds and use the tax increment from that residential TIF area or other funds of the commission, or revenues pledged by the city or town. Local income tax monies frequently are pledged by the city or town to pay a redevelopment bond. But on that type of bond, the redevelopment commission would bear the risk of the non-payment of that. This economic development tax increment revenue bond, the developer is taking the risk. So to the extent the developer doesn't build what it indicates it would build, then it's on the developer, because the TIF just won't be generated, and the bond is structured so that the city, town, commission bears no risk at all. That wouldn't be counted as a default if there's a non-payment against the governmental unit. The other benefit, or perceived benefit from time to time, is that public bidding wouldn't apply to anything that is built or paid for from the proceeds of that economic development revenue bond. So to the extent public bidding is an issue, and frequently for developers it is, there is a way to avoid that process. Next slide. The last thing I just would touch on is the need for a development agreement, and we won't get into a lot of details, but really you should have the redevelopment commission, as you're coming to work with a developer, whether you are fortunate enough to have sort of a developer on the front end and you're creating a residential TIF up front with the developer hand in hand, or if you create the TIF, and in the city of Warsaw's case, the TIF is created and you're kind of in that shovel ready mode and you're bringing a developer on. One of the things to do is make sure you have something in writing with the developer where you're having them commit to what the investment will be, what it will look like, because certainly you will want your standards to be abided by beyond just the normal zoning and plan commission approval process. You may have other things that you want to see in conjunction with the construction of the residential housing. Providing clawbacks, right? You may bring a developer in and the developer's promising the moon and everything's all well and good, and then 3 years later the ground is still sitting fallow, nothing's being built. And so you certainly want the ability to unwind the deal, if you will, if the developer can't bring what they promised to bring. And then you know, if you're providing incentives, if you're doing some sort of bond financing, or whether you're doing it on as a pay-as-you-go basis, you still want to have all of that kind of locked into the development agreement as well. So I've run through a lot. I'm happy to answer any questions, but otherwise I would turn it back over to get Todd on next.
Randy, we do have one question that needs to be answered. It is, in case of mixed use, how is the increment from the retail commercial handled in a residential TIF? And can you have a residential TIF overlap with a regular TIF?
It's a good question. I think you probably can, and I would look, you know, maybe Todd will have a view on it as well. I think you can have the as you designate the residential TIF, you certainly can have it overlapping an existing allocation area, and the magic would be in identifying what would count as residential TIF and make sure you're spending that residential TIF in a way that comports with these statutory provisions. And so you have greater flexibility with the non-residential TIF in that mixed use area, so that you can use that for much more of a variety of projects and things to support other types of economic development activities in that general area. But if you are designating a portion of that existing allocation area as a residential TIF, then you will have a base date that will apply to that residential TIF. You want to be sure that you're capturing the TIF and spending it in compliance with these statutory provisions.
Okay, great. We do have one more question, but it's an accounting question, so I'm going to hold that one for Todd.
That makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, so thank you, Randy and Todd. If you would be so kind as to join me. Are you there?
I am here.
All right, great. Todd, I'm going to let you take it away.
It says, oh, there we go. There's my video. Good morning, everyone. My name is Todd Samuelson. I'm a partner with Baker Tilly, and I've been working as a CPA, financial advisor, now municipal advisor in Indiana for approximately 32 years. Most of that career was with UMBA for the first 30 years or so, and a couple of years ago we combined with Baker Tilly. So if you knew the UMBA group, we are the Baker Tilly group here in Indiana, and obviously a larger footprint. So the Thank you for including me in the information I'm going to go through. One of the benefits of going third from an esteemed panel here, I'm going to try to avoid duplication in terms of information, but and keep us on schedule and leave some time for any further questions. I know we've received some already. So one of in my just for appreciation of the information I'm going to be going through, I do head up the municipal advisory team for Baker Tilly. We have about 180 folks or so, 130 or so here in Indiana that focus on a number of things, financial matters for communities throughout the state. Personally, I spend a lot of time on economic development, strategic planning, as well as working with school corporations. So one of the things you'll note as I go through, maybe I'll point out as I go through the information here, our firm has had the benefit, and I've worked personally with the city of Warsaw for, I think, all of my career, so going on about 30 years, and also work with the school corporation. So obviously have perspective from both sides of the table. And our role in this process, obviously, we're not promoting or advocating for one approach or another, but to provide information to the community, to elected officials and leaders within the community to make good decisions. So I'm going to focus on some of the unique elements, at least what we think is unique to this particular topic on residential TIF, and what questions schools probably will or should be asking, so that communities can prepare. And again, as has been mentioned, and certainly we recommend as well, to have those communications as early in the process as possible. So if we could start the slides, I'm going to probably go quickly through some of these, but I'm going to start with a little bit of theory on why residential TIF. I know you've heard from Jeremy and Randy on this a little bit. One of the benefits, I guess, of being around for some time, you see things ebb and flow. And if you go back long enough on TIF, traditional TIF, there was a day when residential TIF could be captured. And that was taken away by the legislature. And I think primarily because of the impact, real or perceived, that was happening to schools, that, economic development would occur, potentially captured in a TIF area, and the school corporation would see the benefit of new families and students coming in without the benefit of the growth in tax base to help support the costs that come with educating or growth in the student body. So that, again, as you're probably aware, has changed. That residential TIF in the traditional sense is not able to be captured. Kind of fast forward, we've seen, and I'm sure not only here in Indiana, but across the country, many situations where, under the traditional TIF, it's one of the tools that still remains to help communities create jobs, and that has worked, and residential growth would follow, if you will. So the examples that Jeremy talked about in the hurdles, if you will, of that Warsaw felt, we're seeing that in a lot of areas, that you can have the industrial commercial growth, but the residential growth may not coincide with that. You may get the employees for those, but not the residents. So there has been here more recently a bit of a disconnect in, creating jobs, but not having any place for those folks to move into the community to live. I'm sure that's one of the reasons you're on this webinar. So the gaps, if you will, in that, and now can be somewhat addressed by this tool. There are other tools to consider, but our topic here today is residential TIF. So the state, as has been mentioned a couple years ago, brought back the ability to capture residential TIF under certain guidelines and rules that must be followed to help try to combat, if you will, the barriers to this type of development. So next slide. As I talk about and I'm going to get into the case study, if you will, on what type of information was generated and questions for the city as well as the school in Warsaw to help, again, the leadership for the community, I'll call it, from both the city and the school to consider this, these residential TIF areas, and ultimately they were both approved. But taking a step back, we always think it's important that whether it's a traditional TIF or residential, to have some appreciation, if you will, of how this works and what is TIF. And oftentimes TIF is described, or thought of as capturing revenue, and it's really not. I know it kind of gets to that at some point when the TIF revenue or the assessed value is captured, but the focus is capturing new assessed value. And assessed value, and if you kind of think through that, and what potential impacts there could be from anytime the tax base is potentially impacted, or the benefit to the tax base is deferred, which is really what happens in a TIF scenario, then how does tax base fit into the overall funding mechanism, not only for the city or town or county, but also the school corporation? Because the funding of schools and the funding mechanisms for cities, towns, counties are pretty different. So in terms of having these conversations with and developing and answering questions and developing support for what's best for your community, having some appreciation or understanding of how these tools work, because they are different, is going to be important to the success of understanding the issues and being able to address those. So again, I'm going to focus on what happens when assessed value is captured for the next slide. Then this may be the slide that Randy was talking about. I hope we didn't steal this from Barnes and Thornburg, but we've been using it for years. The mechanics of TIF, and for financial advisors and CPAs, this is probably as creative as we get in doing graphics, but it has been explained by both Jeremy and Randy, so I won't spend a lot of time. But in the blue on this chart is the assessed value, or the base assessed value, that exists, again, whether this is a traditional TIF area or for a residential TIF area. And then once the area is created, the increment in the assessed value in the green is able to be captured. And again, that is from, and the letters are capitalized, from new development that occurs within that redevelopment area. And I know it's not clinically a 25-year life on residential TIF, depending on when that first obligation is experienced. But in this example, it would be a max, or go out 25 years. And certainly redevelopment commissions can have a shorter time frame. And we've certainly seen that communities want to set up a TIF area for and sunset that at 15, 20, something locally, but the maximum would be 25 years from that first obligation. So once the area does sunset, that area, or the growth in the tax base, gets released. So in orange, all of that assessed value then flows to the overlapping units, and the benefits that accrue from growth in tax base would accrue to those units as well. Next slide. So a little more basic, and Randy had something similar, but this represents a potential area that there's not a lot of development. So this would be the base. So that, again, focusing on that tax base times the tax rate for that area generates the revenue that gets allocated to the county, school, library, city, or town. Townships could also be part of this as well, or would be. Next slide. With the creation of a residential TIF area in this picture, as that development occurs, the base value, which is a carryover from the previous slide, doesn't change. And so that revenue stream, or that tax base, if you will, continues to benefit the overlapping units, and the revenue that accrues from it is settled or allocated to the same units. Above the line for the new development, that revenue would be captured and redirected to the redevelopment commission. I would also point out that redevelopment commissions on an annual basis need to make a determination if they're going to take all of the TIF revenue, and in order to carry out the plan or meet obligations of the redevelopment commission. So again, that's part of the traditional TIF scenario, and one that would carry over as well. Next slide. So the similarities to residential TIF and traditional TIF, there are many. The overall mechanics and the calculations associated with creating a TIF area are very similar. There are certain nuances that need to be thought about in terms of how residential housing is assessed and how that assessment is translated to tax base. Once consideration of deductions, et cetera, because those are unique and different for residential, especially homestead, if they're going to be homestead residential properties. So that needs to be taken into account as you anticipate or predict what the assessed value or the capture of assessed value might be, because it is net assessed value, not gross, that would be captured. So don't focus on the market value, but what the net assessed value would be. So again, the overall mechanics are similar, but how commercial and industrial is assessed is going to be different than residential, and how you get to ultimately the tax base. Randy and Jeremy both talked about the approvals. I do want to address, there was a question earlier about the tax impact statement, whether or not that includes future budget increases for the overlapping taxing units. I believe that was the question. So I have a two-part answer to that question because we develop a lot of the tax impact statements that are provided to the overlapping taxing units. Typically or clinically, we try to isolate the impact of the creation of the area without changing the other variables, if you will, in terms of changes in levies by the overlapping units or other changes to assessed value going forward. Again, that is going to be more traditional in an impact statement to focus on the impact of creating the TIF area itself. However, the second part to my answer would be, and you'll see this when I get into the case study, is that we would recommend that as you look at the potential impact of creating a residential TIF or any TIF area, that type of modeling be included and bring in other factors of changes to tax base, changes to levies of overlapping units to the extent those can be reasonably predicted, because again, more information, the better. So the other question that Randy wanted me to speak to, or again, the TIF can be pledged to bonds or leases, whether or not for a residential TIF area limited to one bond issue. To the extent it is available, we would certainly recommend considering or having that approval of being able to issue that one series or that bond issue in multiple series. Primarily from a matching principle, being able to match the revenue stream to the debt service payments. Many times, and we saw the same thing anticipated in Warsaw, that not all of that residential TIF is going to show up on, or residential development, excuse me, is going to show up on day one. So it's anticipated that it would be over time, potentially even phased developments. So the extent you can match those revenue streams to the incentives or debt service payments would be the most efficient way to do it. Next slide. What are some of the differences? Obviously, it's been highlighted. The main difference for creating a residential TIF to a traditional TIF is the approval by the school corporation. So I'm not going to, Randy and Jeremy did a great job of covering the other elements or requirements that are, so I'm going to focus again on the school approval and get into a case study of how that, or the experience in Warsaw and other parts of the state where we have been involved in creating residential TIFs. So the next slide I had in here is also on the 1% test, which Randy covered. We just got a brief example, a very simple example of how that math you would look at for seeing if you meet that test, or again, the exception to that with the target area could also be considered. But again, since that's been covered, I'm going to go to and try to get into a case study here pretty quickly, and then again leave time for some questions. So the next slide, as we were, and again, you heard from Jeremy all the planning that was going on for the city of Warsaw up until the point they wanted to consider creating these residential TIFs. And when the topic came up, and the school corporation became aware, they started to have some questions. They were familiar, and I think the city and the school have been good partners over the years, because the city does have TIF areas, traditional TIF areas, obviously. And going back in time, the school corporation and, again, if you're around long enough, you remember things. The school corporation and the city had some agreements around some of the TIF areas, and even it's required that the school corporation be notified, and if there was going to be an expansion and some other things that were some interlocal agreements not required by the statute. So the process, if you will, of cooperation between the city and the school has historically been there. And this was another example where, and even outside of the required public hearings, we certainly were part of many meetings of leadership of the city and the school to understand, be able to ask questions, and then we were asked to put together what the impacts might be. So for creating residential TIF, considerations that you can expect or should think about is looking at, and some of these may be more concrete if you've got a development that is on the table, so to speak, or some of it may be a little bit soft in terms of, we want to create the residential TIF area. We believe it'll be helpful in carrying out our objectives for growth in housing stock. And we think, it may play out in a certain way. So, we try to work with, and in this case certainly did, with Jeremy and the city. What do you think the growth in the housing stock will look like? What might that be versus what you have been experiencing? And Jeremy touched on that. And then we're going to start to translate that to what this may mean to the school corporation. So obviously, if you know about school funding, that if there's an ability for the development to lead to a growth in students that would be attending the schools, there's going to be a direct benefit or impact on the revenue that would be generated for the school corporation through the funding formula. So the funding that comes from the state is based on per pupil, the majority of that funding. In Warsaw's case, they would receive, Warsaw schools, a little over $6,000 per student. So that was factored into the overall impact developed for both the city and the school. The other consideration, and Randy touched on it, there is a plan that needs to be, economic development plan that does need to be for any TIF area generated, but also for residential TIF. So the monies that you see for the school corporation of $6,000 per student would go to the education fund. I'm going to talk about school funding here again here shortly. But if you know about school funding, the $6,000 per student goes to the education fund. And the education fund is primarily used for what you would expect, for teachers, benefits, et cetera, for the education of the student body. The economic, or the concern, I don't know if it's a concern, but the question that you may expect is, that's all great for the education fund, but if we start to experience capacity issues with our buildings, again, talking from the school's perspective, those dollars that would come from the state for the education fund are not eligible for the school corporation to utilize if there becomes a capacity issue and you need to expand a particular elementary school or something along those lines. So there may be some question or consideration within the economic development plan that the city, town, or county needs to develop that makes some of the TIF revenue available down the road to address school capacity. Maybe a question or a consideration that gets discussed. Next slide, please. I talked about the school funding considerations again with residential TIF, and we, in Warsaw's case, work closely with Jeremy and his team on what that housing change or housing stock change might look like. Looked at the demographics within the community of how many students might you expect for residential homes, translating that to, again, the per pupil funding that the school corporation receives, and and this is probably the most straightforward and easiest to estimate is what the impact would be to the school's education fund. Again, that is coming from state funding per pupil, and those dollars are available, as you see there, for the general operate, mostly teacher salary and benefits and other expenses associated with the delivery of education. So what you don't see is the education fund is not supported by property taxes. So the question of TIF impact does not accrue to the education fund. And again, if you go back 30 some years, that was much different than it is today on how schools are funded. But under today's funding mechanisms, property taxes do not or are not utilized directly for the education fund. Next slide. So when we're talking about potential impact of creating a TIF area, we need then to look at the local funds, as they are called, that are supported by property taxes. And basically there are three types. The first, and again, understanding how schools are funded will go a long way to enhancing the conversation and understanding between the city, town, or county looking to create a residential TIF and how it may or may not impact the school in terms of funding. So the school funding that comes from property taxes, if the school has a referendum that has been approved either for operations or for capital projects, that is the first priority of funding from property taxes. And if you could visually draw a line there, that first priority would be outside of the circuit breaker, meaning that that funding mechanism and the tax rate associated with referendums is outside any limitation that would be created by the circuit breaker. And I'm going to give away the answer here before I go through the slides, that typically when we're talking about questions from the school or any overlapping taxing unit, the circuit breaker impact and what that would mean through the creation of a TIF area in just about every circumstance is going to be the primary consideration. So there's a spoiler for you in terms of what is the primary financial consideration in discussing with the schools is what is the impact going to be from the circuit breaker. And if you go back to what I mentioned earlier and appreciate that TIF is really a capture of growth in tax base, not in dollars, but in tax base, then also with some appreciation of how the circuit breaker works, then you can really tie those two concepts together, that any potential changes or impact to the tax base is going to lead to a discussion around circuit breaker. So any referendums outside that circuit breaker consideration or impact, the other for debt that is inside or not has not gone through a referendum. And obviously the operations fund for the school is locally funded through property tax. So those would have impact from circuit breaker discussion. Next slide. So quickly on a case study, try to leave time for more questions or wrap up here. Again, we worked very closely and have for years with the school and the city. So we were happy to help provide information around questions or what the school corporation, the superintendent, business manager, and the board. And I can tell you in other circumstances of doing residential TIF around the state, the questions are fairly similar. And sometimes if they don't know what questions to ask, typically it's going to come down to the circuit breaker and what type of impact it may have. So what we did in communication is going to be very key throughout this process. But we looked at how the potential residential TIF scenario, how that could accelerate in working with Jeremy, best information available and estimates of how this may play out, and how that plays with the overall residential TIF, residential construction that is occurring within the community. All of this is going to be case by case, and around the state, we've certainly seen different assumptions that need to be utilized, but again, it's going to be case by case, but the general concepts are going to be similar, we believe, in terms of what questions and what information should be considered. At the end of the day, when we went through we went through the analysis of what this TIF area, residential TIF area, could do in terms of new growth, and what impact that may have on the school corporation. As you see in the last bullet there, the impact was about $10,000 annually, and we did a 10-year window. So at the end of that 10 years, we thought or estimated that the revenue loss through the circuit breaker would be about $10,000 to the school corporation. And over that 10-year period, I can tell you that it was about $1,000 per year increment. So in other words, year one, about $1,000 impact, year five, about 5,000. And that's, again, a function of how the circuit breaker works and the assumptions that went into the analysis. Next slide. So in doing this type of analysis, you got to probably start, or would need to start, with an appreciation of what the historical has been on circuit breaker that have been occurring within the school corporation, both on a historical basis, and then translate that. And this goes back to a question that was asked earlier, taking into consideration, how levies are going to change over time, how tax base may change over time. And this particular question, I mean, we even went out to school, wanted to see this out for the potential life of the TIF area of 20 years. During that period of time, and Jeremy mentioned they have other TIF areas in Warsaw. Well, one of those would expire during that 20-year period. So, all of that's taken into account when that northern TIF area would expire. That, and if you remember the earlier chart, all of that captured tax base would be released to the overlapping units. Then you can see the circuit breaker impact would, for the school and quite honestly for the city and county at that time as well, will go down fairly dramatically. So this information was, again, gone through and explained the impacts to both the city and the school. Next slide. And what we did in summary here was look at, for the impact, again, over the next 10 years from when this area was created, what would be the impact to the school corporation on their net levy. And I choose those words carefully because the school and any unit of government now with the circuit breaker in place needs to be focused on and thinking about net levy as opposed to total property tax levy. The total property tax levy for the school corporation, and remember, this has nothing to do with the education fund. They will get dollars out of growth from student coming in the door, but this is the local property tax dollars for primarily the operations fund and debt service. If you add up the light orange and the dark orange there, that's their total levy. The dark orange would be what they lose to the circuit breaker. So our estimate of the baseline, again, without creation of the residential TIF area, that at the end of the 10-year period, the school corporation's net levy would be approximately $25,184,000. And with the creation of the TIF area, the estimated levy, and again, primarily driven by changes to the circuit breaker, would be approximately $10,000 less than that. Next slide. So the results of that case study, again, there were other questions that Warsaw schools had, and you might expect or anticipate from school corporations in your community that would be similar. But they also had questions around what would happen to the spending power for the school corporation in general. So we looked at that again with a baseline and with the residential TIF. The annual growth in spending power, you can see there, in factoring in what we believe the max or the growth in the maximum levy would be over that time frame. They also had questions, and this goes back to the scenario I mentioned earlier, that if the housing or the residential TIF is wildly successful, if you will, and there's a lot of families that are coming and moving into Warsaw, and if that creates a capacity issue that the school needs to address facilities, they wanted to know what happens to their general obligation bonding capacity. So we went through calculations on that as well. to ensure they would have the ability to consider that's not their total capacity. That would be the change in their capacity going forward. So, and I had already mentioned in summary the $10,000 annual impact at the end of that 10-year period. So these were the results of the analysis. We went through in a year or two after the city of Warsaw went through this process, a neighboring town that also is in the Warsaw School District approached the school for creation of a residential TIF area as well. And I mentioned before, in the economic development plan for Warsaw's residential TIF areas, the city and the school did agree to add language around, to the extent available, there would be the ability to use TIF money for school facilities to address capacity issues. In a year or two later, when the neighboring town, the agreement, if you will, or the communications between the town and the school were a little bit different. They had immediate needs at the school that was going to be in that area of the corporation that the redevelopment commission for that town agreed to participate in addressing. So lots of ways that these plans can be put together, and cooperation, and really taking a step back and focusing on what's best for the community is, again, the recommended course of communication and information to be developed. So with that, that I believe is the last slide that I have, and be glad to answer any questions that came up, Lisa, through the chat or otherwise.
It is the last slide that we have. So Randy and Jeremy, if you would like to join us, we have one question that I believe you guys have not answered, but if our audience has any last minute questions they'd like to throw into the chat, now is the time to do so. So the question is, are there limits on the number of new houses that can be built in a city/town that could prevent the use of residential TIF? And I don't know who wants to take that question, but there it is.
I can jump in because I think it goes to so there is the 1% test that we talked about. And so I won't go through all that again, but certainly to the extent that you are above that 1% threshold, that could be a problem. But as I said, with the recent amendment last year to allow cities and towns to designate areas as economic development target areas and avoid the 1% test, I think, so again, that would mean that if you had extensive growth in another part of the city, but you're really trying to focus residential growth in a part that's not so, hasn't been so successful, you would still have the ability to do that using that economic development target area designation.
Okay. Any last minute questions? Now's your chance. Okay. Why does the impact tax statement exclude any increases in future budget increases for the units? I'm going to throw that one to Todd.
Yeah, I'm going to pull that up and make sure I understand the question. The impact statement, again, and it doesn't have to exclude that. Certainly, the statutory requirement, this is an accountant talking about statutes. Randy can correct me as needed, but the statutory requirements wouldn't be there to do that, and that's not a good answer. What I'm leading to is, if the impact statement and the community wants to see that type of analysis or the overlapping units, it can certainly be part of the impact statement. And I didn't want to suggest that it wouldn't be. What I'm suggesting is traditionally it is not, in order to focus and try to minimize or limit the number of variables that are changing in providing the answer, if you will, of what is the potential impact to the overlapping units, so that it is focused on the creation of the TIF and the potential capture of, and primarily the impact statement, and Randy touched on this, is going to be a function of the but-for test, that the creation of the residential TIF or other traditional TIF areas and what that would lead to in terms of development, that really is the focus on, again, tax base, not the levies, which I believe is your question, but to focus on what happens if and when the tax base would change or increases to that tax base. And sometimes there's a clear example of in an impact statement of what I'm talking about. If you're creating an area that has some resident or I'll say commercial or industrial in that area, that they have an abatement and that abatement's going to be rolling off. Clearly the roll off of that abatement could be captured as TIF. Well, by putting a TIF area there, that does have impact to the overlapping units, because without the TIF, the roll off of that tax abatement would benefit the overlapping units. So those are the types of impacts that are typically included in the impact statement itself. But as I mentioned, the planning, if you will, between the city, town, county, and the schools, or even internally, in the financial modeling of what could happen in the financial planning, you can certainly include budget increases going forward.
Great. All right. In the interest of time, that's going to be our last question. I did get a number of questions about when this will be posted on our website. So we're anticipating that we'll post the recording of this session next week. If you've missed any of our previous sessions, please feel free to check those out at regionalopportunityinc.org. I want to thank our speakers for spending a lot of time explaining a very complicated sounding tool that I think will be really beneficial for our communities today. So thank you, Todd and Randy and Jeremy. I really appreciate your time and your effort today. And we hope to see you all, our participants, on our next webinar session. So thank you and have a great day.